I just moved to this very remote area of a farming town for a really cheap price. There is not much to do here, but thankfully I stay pretty busy with work, which makes me travel every couple of weeks. I bought this ranch house that seems to be out in the middle of nowhere, and that is by design. I get overly stressed at work, so the last thing I want to do with my spare time is to deal with more people. The home is large and unfortunately rather empty. I never married or had any kids of any kind, but the older I get, the more I consider starting a family. I purchased the ranch home sight unseen, but I mainly did it for the vast amount of land it was on. If I didn't like the house, I could always rebuild and still save money buying something similar in the city. The road that took me to the property was long and desolate, which always reminded me how alone I was out here. The road connected to a dirt path, which eventually led to my house. On the dirt path was a rather odd light post that somehow worked, that shined an eerie orange glow. I don't know how it always had power to it, but it was always on. A few hundred yards past the light post was the ranch house. The ranch house was old and it had a weird smell to it. I guess that's what you get for buying it sight unseen. My first night there seemed fine. Nothing too crazy happened, other than being in a house too big and too empty. I tried my best to sleep, but something about being in a new home for the first time made it difficult for me to sleep. I went to grab a midnight snack, and I glanced out the kitchen window to the endless abyss that was the night sky. The orange glow of the light post a few hundred yards away was a small beacon of light that peered through the thick cover of darkness. I noticed the house creaked and groaned more than normal, but I think that was just me being alone more than anything. I was only able to stay one night before having to leave for a work trip the next day. While I'm away, I decided to hire a groundskeeper to keep an eye on the property. The groundskeeper is a local named Mel, who is an older man and doesn't talk much, but I respect him. I get back from my work trip and Mel had moved all my items from my old house to my new one and took care of the property. What a gem. I asked Mel how things were while I was away, and he didn't seem too interested in talking, but he was still polite. I decided to take a tour of the town I had recently moved to and see what kind of nightlife there was. To my expectations, there was little to no nightlife, other than your typical bars with your typical bar rats. I decided to call it a night and made my way back home. I left the well-lit city and began my drive into the dark country. The night was dark and had a brisk chill in the air. My headlights seemed to only illuminate what seemed to be 15 feet or so ahead of me, since there were no streetlights to guide me. Thankfully, I didn't have that much to drink, and I was somewhat alert on my drive back. About 5 minutes away or so from my house, my headlights illuminated something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was something like a tumbleweed or a piece of trash, but my eyes began to adjust, and I realized that there was some kind of animal hunched over at the middle of the road. I slowed my vehicle to stop about 30 feet away from what appeared to be some kind of wolf-like creature that was eating a calf. Something about what I was looking at looked natural, yet so very wrong. I haven't seen a wolf in real life, but I knew that there was something very off with what I was looking at. I felt this feeling of complete dread, as if I was looking at death itself. I began to drive past this morbid sight when the creature turned and faced me while it stood upright. The wolf stood up 7 feet tall, but that's not what I noticed first. Its eyes burned a dark red, and they were eyes of death. I sped past the creature, feeling completely in fear of my life. I felt that if the creature had been able to actually catch my vehicle, I would have been in harm's way. I sped down the road, leaving the creature in the dust, but my home wasn't much further. I was a bit worried that if the thing wanted to, it could have followed me to my home, since I only lived a few minutes away. I reached the dirt road and drove faster than I should have. Thankfully, I made it safely back home despite some rather reckless driving. I sprinted from my car to my home, since I didn't know if there were more of those large wolf-like creatures hiding in the darkness. It was like when you felt something behind you when you walked back from using the bathroom at night. I quickly locked my door behind me, and I looked out the window, somewhat expecting to see something. But fortunately, there was nothing outside but the orange light in the mist of darkness. I began to settle down, thinking about the event with the terrifying creature was now over. Or so I thought. The next day I was to go out again for another week, so I gave Mel a call letting him know that I would need him to swing by the property in the morning and to keep an eye on things. I went to bed and found myself in the most terrifying dream. I found myself on the road where I saw that thing, but this time I wasn't in my car. Instead of the thing being hunched over the dead calf, there was a woman, an old woman wearing many skins of various animals. Her face was old and withered. Her eyes were white. She was whispering something that I couldn't understand, and then I woke up. My phone showed the time that it was 4:27 a.m. I got up and I grabbed a midnight snack in the kitchen, trying my best to avoid looking out any windows. I couldn't stop thinking about my dream. What did my dream mean? Why did I dream of an old woman instead of that creature? I tried my best to avoid looking out any of the windows the rest of the evening. Morning finally came, and I didn't get any more sleep. Mel came and I gave him the keys to the house. For a moment, I thought to share what had happened last night with Mel, but I thought against it. The whole week I was away, I kept dreaming of that night. Each time I dreamt of the event, I was closer than I was before. The woman would be closer each time and would be speaking louder and louder in some language I couldn't understand. One of the days I was away, I get a call from Mel. He asked me if I'd been expecting family or friends. I tell him I have neither. He gets really quiet and then he tells me that he thinks he saw someone on the property a few times, but he can't be sure. My heart drops. For some reason I can't help but think it's the old woman from the dreams. I come home from my business trip and I ask Mel if anything else had happened. He told me nothing else happened, but he thinks at one point someone has been inside my house. He said he called the police and they investigated the property, but didn't find anything other than large animal tracks. Ever since then, I felt like something is lurking just outside and is waiting to come in. Whatever that thing was I saw that night, I'm pretty sure that it knows where I live. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for a party that evening. The party was at a house that did not have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard weird noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was that opened the truck door began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunts and uncles were frightened by the sight, and they knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger, but with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My uncle ran towards the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what it was doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed them all over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out into the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever the thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunts and uncles inside, and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on a particular spot. My uncles swear that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours, like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew that it was her, and to leave the family alone. A few days passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed away. Many people believe that if you yell the name of the Skinwalker, they die. While on vacation in Arizona in 2013, I was visiting family who lived on the edge of the Navajo reservation. The town they lived in is basically on the border of the reservations and such things. The family in question is my mother's brother and sister. They live together with their spouses in a modest home, but the home is unimportant. I went there during my childhood every now and then and had several Navajo friends, so after a night out catching up with my two oldest friends, whose name I will not mention because of the events that took place that night, I was driving with two of them home. The female friend, we'll call her Sue, was fast asleep on the right side of the back seat, while the male friend, whom we should call Jim, was wide awake on the left side of the back seat. As we are on our way to Jim's house, I see something on the side of the road that is briefly illuminated by my headlights. It looked like a large coyote walking down the side of the road on all fours. Jim saw it first and pointed it out to me, so I slowed down and I turned my brights on. What we both saw disturbed us so deeply that we had to wake up Sue to see that she'd confirm that we were not crazy. When Sue woke up and looked out the window, I had stopped the car at this point. She froze in her place, and the thing, which had been walking along leisurely, turned around and stood up on its hind legs. It did not look like a dog, when dogs stand upright, but rather a person. Before Sue could shake herself out of the soul-crushing fear she was in, Jim and I got a good look at it. It was everything that a stereotypical definition of a werewolf was, with a few key differences. We saw its snout was less than a wolf's and more of a hybrid between a wolf and a human, rounded with a dog's nose slightly protruding out and sharp teeth. Its hands and feet were both claws on which were seemingly permanently extended. That or it was extremely hostile at the moment it saw us. By the time we were done gawking at the thing, and fear started to take over curiosity, Sue snapped out of her own fear long enough to scream at me to drive as fast as I could. She refused to stop screaming until it was completely out of sight, and when we pulled over and she calmed down enough to regain coherency, we asked her what was going on. She explained that she couldn't tell us why, but she knew what the thing was, and that it wanted nothing but to hurt her and anyone related to her. When I dropped her off at our house, I and Jim as well felt obligated to walk her to her door. We asked Sue if she was going to be okay, and she said that her dad would protect her, like he'd always done. On our way to Jim's house, we saw it again, but it was heading the opposite direction, to Sue's house. We thought it was either another one or the same one which we'd sawn earlier. We decided that it was our duty as friends to Sue to try and protect her from whatever that thing was. We turned around, but when we did so, the creature reared up once again and looked at us. Then something I'll never forget happened. It let loose a deep and guttural roar directed at us. A roar so bestial in nature that it shook both of us to our cores. Apparently we were not the only ones that were shaken, as my car's radio died and the engine shut off. I screamed at the top of my lungs, accompanied by Jim, and fumbled to turn it back on. By the time the creature was halfway to our car, it was walking into the road towards us. I got it back on in time to floor it out of there as fast as possible. When I finally got slowed down enough to not break every speed limit in America, I realized I'd passed Jim's house, about 3 miles back. I didn't see the creature again that night, although I drove by Sue's house again, and everything seemed fine. No broken windows, no sign of forced entry, and I haven't seen anything like it since. I don't know what to call it other than a skinwalker, but whatever it was hostile, and it plagued either the local community or one of my friends specifically. I have kept in touch with both Jim and Sue. She refuses to talk about it, and will only say things are fine when I ask about it. Jim can't get anything out of her, either. I live in rural New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque. Last summer I was stringing coral fence. A Navajo friend, Tom Bill, visiting while he attended a powwow in Albuquerque, watched as I hammered away at a corner post. The horses began to spook. "What's got them stirred up?" he asked. I told him that every night coyotes ran down the road, making the dogs bark and the horses go crazy. Then Tom told me a story. One night last April, about 2 a.m., he said I was driving along the Crow Point Road in my truck when I heard a noise. Seemed at first to be coming from the engine, a strange sound, like a dog panting. I got car trouble, I thought. Then I heard a footfall behind me, back over my right shoulder. I looked down at the speedometer, and I was traveling about 55 or 60 miles an hour. I glanced into my rearview mirror, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. There was some guy I'd never seen, a Navajo, and he was running just in the back of my tailgate. I couldn't see his face, just his torso lit up by my taillights, his arms and legs flying up and down incredibly fast. I sped up to around 75 and looked back. He had disappeared, but I heard a breathing sound right behind my left ear. I looked out the window, and there he was, running along, keeping pace with me. As I was looking at him out the window, he veered off towards Crow Point. I knew he was no ordinary man because he was traveling so fast. Just before he disappeared into the brush, he had changed into a wolf, so you better watch out. Those coyotes spooking your horses may not be coyotes, but rather something more sinister.